All right, welcome to another broadcast of Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet. We have Captain Ron in the house. We have a great show for you guys tonight. We have Kevin Randle, who has more than 45 years of research experience of UFO phenomenon, and I'm so excited to have him here today. His training in the Army and Air Force provides Randle with a keen insight to the operations and protocol of the military, which military and UFOs go hand in hand, and their investigation into UFOs and its phenomenon that has can't even say it. Let's try that again. Puzzled people for more than a century, actually even longer than that, even biblical years. So, but during his investigation, Randle has traveled to the United States to interview hundreds of witnesses who are involved in everything from Roswell, New Mexico crash in 1947, in which we went down for the 70th anniversary. We had a great time. To the repeated radar sightings of UFOs over Washington, D.C. in 1952, and even the latest abduction case.
Mr. Randle's one of these early Roswell investigators.
My God.
He's the king of the castle here.
All right, well, we want to welcome Kevin Randle to Truth Be Told, and the applause goes out.
Are we there?
Oh, we're
Welcome
here.
Welcome to the show, sir.
We're here.
I didn't hear you said we're going to welcome him, and there was no welcome, so I was just waiting for a welcome.
Well, we did an applause, so you probably
can't hear the applause.
Yeah, the applause.
So there we go.
You took your bow, so that's great.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Of course, and first of all, we were at the 70th anniversary of Roswell in last June, July. We had such a great time. First time I got to experience it. I even drove out to the ranch, even though I didn't get to go on the land because it's private property.
Which ranch?
I just
the one up near Corona, or the one closer to Roswell?
Closest to Roswell. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course, I was just kind of out there, and the guy's like, "Oh yeah, just go up there and knock on the door," and I'm like, "No, I'm good. I'm not going to get arrested or anything." But I wanted to find out through you with the now 70 years later, or now 71 years later, what do you feel like is the most, I guess, pristine and hard evidence that compelling that really proves that Roswell happened?
The only thing we really can put our fingers on is the witness testimony.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're dealing with here are the men who were at the very top of the chain of command at the Roswell Army Airfield. Everyone that we were able to talk to, who would have been on Colonel Blanchard's staff, he being the commanding officer.
Right.
But people like Jesse Marcel and the other members of the staff, everyone that we were able to talk to and interview, told us this thing happened. Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, he was responsible for the security on the base. He was responsible for the MPs patrolling downtown. And when they cordoned off the area, it was his guys who had done it. I had asked him at one point if we were following the right path. And he says, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, we think it was extraterrestrial." And he said, "Well, let me say this. It's not the wrong path." He was telling us, in essence, we're going down the right path to toward the extraterrestrial. I mean, here was a guy who was there, very reluctant to talk about much because as he told me, he'd promised the president he wouldn't talk about it. I'm not sure if he talked to Truman or if he talked to the president's representative, which would have been the same thing, of course. But so if you'd asked him specific questions, well, what did the craft look like? He said, "Well, I can't talk about that. I was sworn to secrecy." But we could work around some of those things because I think he felt obligated to answer the questions as honestly as he could. And I always appreciated that with him. And he did mention to family members something about creatures and that sort of thing. But when you were talking to him, he was very, very reticent to talk about any of that sort of thing. So the best evidence that we're looking at is the testimony of those people. Unfortunately, that's all clouded by the testimony of so many people who are making up their involvement. I think specifically of Frank Kaufman and Glenn Dennis. I don't think they had any involvement at all in this sort of thing, and they just jumped on the bandwagon as this thing got building in the early 1990s. They came up with these wonderful stories of seeing creatures and bodies and all of this stuff, and it just didn't pan out when we were able to dig a little bit deeper. Kaufman, for example, he showed us his discharge papers from the Army. And it talked about how he'd been trained in intelligence and all that sort of thing, and that he had been a retired master sergeant or had been discharged as a master sergeant. I'm looking at the papers. I never thought that anybody would forge those sorts of things. And when we got the documents from St. Louis, which would be an independent source, it turned out that he wasn't trained in intelligence and he had been a staff sergeant. Not exactly the same thing.
Right.
And I didn't even begin looking at this stuff until I'd read a book called Stolen Valor. And it's about all these people claiming their military experience who have none. And when you begin to check these things out, you realize all these people are lying about it. I think the statistic that got me the most was there was a survey done that was connected with the census in the mid 1990s about how many people were Vietnam veterans. Now you have to remember at that time they were talking about maybe 2.5 million people who actually served in country. Mostly men, very few women. Mostly nurses were the women, but there were some women who held other jobs who were in Vietnam, but very few women. 2.5 million. And the survey results showed that 13 million said, yeah, we were in Vietnam. Well, 11.5 million of them were lying about it.
Right.
That's a lot.
Why? on a census form, why would you lie about that? So, after reading that book, I began to try to verify the military credentials that people were offering up as proof to their credibility. And I can't tell you how many times I was disappointed in learning that the people who were claiming these credentials, like Frank Kaufman, were making them up. So
it's horrible that clouds the whole thing. Between
Right.
you, Don Schmidt, and Stanton Friedman, there's so many interviews with so many people. I just feel like a lot of it's very compelling to me because there's the depth and breadth of the interviews. There's so many people. They have the coroner, him getting called in the middle of the night. That's compelling.
But that was Glenn Dennis, and it turns out his story isn't true.
Right. Exactly. But I mean, initially when you hear that, I find that very compelling. And then you hear this and it starts clouding it, and it's like, well, that's kind of why I was on board, So you wonder, why did this guy do that, and why?
This is why I did the book Roswell in the 21st Century. I wanted to take a look at the evidence as it existed in 2015, 2016. What could we say about it? What do we think? What do we know? And what can we prove? And it turned out what we thought was a lot more robust than what we could actually prove about the case, and we're left with the testimonies. We know something fell because we've got the newspaper articles, we've got some of the message traffic that took place between the various headquarters involved. We've got General Ramey's statement, all that sort of thing. But when you get right down to it, that's not as robust as we had thought originally. And there were these avenues that we pursued that we thought would give us better information. People were saying, well, you need to look at this. And we go look at it, and it turned out not to be true. One of the great stories was I'd been told about a guy, a retired colonel, who had flown Air Force One, and he had flown President Kennedy to look at the alien bodies. I got to find this guy. And was successful in finding him. Talked to him about it. Well, yeah, he had flown Air Force One, and yes, he had flown President Kennedy around, and yes, he had seen an alien creature, but it all didn't come together into one neat package like that. He had seen a UFO, and through the dome on the disc, he'd seen some kind of an alien creature. It had nothing to do with Roswell, had nothing to do with bodies, and had nothing to do with taking the president to see the bodies. Wonderful story, and when we finally got to the bottom of it, it just didn't pan out as well as I would have liked it to. So we had to look at that, but I did Roswell in the 21st Century, look at that. But the other thing we have to fight, and I want to bring that up, is this Project Mogul nonsense. They're always saying, well, what's the evidence? What do you have? A Project Mogul said, well, Project Mogul proves that it was some kind of classified balloon project. The balloon project wasn't classified. It was out in the open. It was New York University balloon project. The purpose was classified, but the name wasn't classified. And the guys in Alamogordo who were running the project knew it was Mogul because it was written down in various documents that survived from 1947. But the point is, people just reject Roswell now because of Project Mogul. And when you say, yes, but Dr. Albert Crary, who is running the project, tells us that the balloon flight that allegedly left the debris didn't fly. It was canceled. And so they want us to provide documentation, and we provide documentation, and then they argue with us. And I'm thinking, if I'm a skeptic, I can't pick and choose the information I want to accept. And, I've got a wonderful explanation. It's Project Mogul. And then suddenly someone comes up and says, well, the documentation shows that that flight never flew and all the other flights are accounted for. Where does that leave you? And they're saying, well, his diary said that they flew a cluster of balloons and we don't know what that meant. Yes, we do. It's detailed in the documentation exactly what it was. And we know exactly what happened. And it never really got off the Alamogordo White Sands missile range area. So they weren't worried about it clogging up traffic. And it was just a cluster of balloons to raise a microphone, or what they called a sonobuoy, to see if it could pick up detonations on the ground, because they couldn't do anything else that day because the regular flight had been canceled. But, so the book looks at all of that stuff, including all the various minutia about Project Mogul, the minutia about MJ-12. It looks at the plane San Augustine connection, but it looks at the Roswell case and what the evidence shows us and what the witnesses have said from the very first times they were interviewed and the recordings of the interviews that we have up until the time that we get into the middle of the beginning of the 21st century. And the case is nowhere near as robust as it had been, because so much of the testimony.
Do you think it's still a good case? I mean, that seems to be the most documented case ever.
There are some very credible people, and every time I get really worried about the Roswell case, I think back to Edwin Easley, who was the provost marshal, and my discussions with him. And if there had been nothing there, he would have said so. I think back to some of the ranchers in the area we talked to who were involved in this in various fashions, and that's very credible. Mac Brazel, the rancher who found it, was held in Roswell for about a week, as near as we can figure on the timeline. And Edwin Easley told me, yeah, he wasn't held in the brig or in the stockade. He was held in the guest house. And I'm thinking, if you're locked in a door and there's a guard on the door, then you're pretty much in jail. And that sort of thing. So we have some of those things that are very, very interesting. But when we get to some of the ancillary topics, they break down. One of the best avenues that we still have to explore is this message held by General Ramey. General Ramey was the commanding officer of the 8th Air Force, and the 509th Bomb Group in Roswell was part of that organization. And Ramey is photographed in his office with a memo in his hand, and you can almost read it. It's there are some words you can read, so by looking at that, we can deduce that it is based on Roswell, but we just can't read some of the critical parts of it. And there's been an awful lot of work on trying to decipher what this memo said. I think Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates, my new best friend, explored the Ramey Memo in one of the episodes in October and showed what has been done and what the current state of that investigation is, with some very interesting things. A fellow in New Zealand has been ramrodding an attempt to decipher this memo, working with David Rudiak and me on some of those aspects of it. David and I kind of disagree on some of the interpretations of the memo, but if the memo says what David Rudiak says it says, well, then here is the smoking gun. If it says something less dramatic, it doesn't necessarily rule out an alien craft at Roswell, but it is the last best piece of evidence that I think that we have, unless somebody can find a file in Washington, D.C. or wherever they're hidden now and release it to the public, something that we can trace back to its source and get FOIA requests in and said, yes, this is a legitimate document that says this sort of thing, and here are the people involved. Here are the photographs that were taken, and here's the autopsy reports, and here's all this information that I think a hoaxer couldn't possibly make up, even in today's environment. But unless we get something like that or an admission from the government, I think we're kind of stymied on that. And we say, well, yeah, it's a very good case, and it's clearly something happened, and clearly there was a response to it that seemed to be out of line with a terrestrial explanation. But there's something that went on at Roswell, and my inclination to say it was alien oriented. But if you're looking at it from the point of view of what does the evidence tell you, you have to say, well, we just don't really get to that point with the evidence we currently have, which is not to say we won't eventually get that evidence.
You can't help but think that it's purposely clouded, Before we moved on to the Socorro case, what about, you were talking about these documents, what about the MJ-12 documents? What's your thought on the authenticity of those?
They have none.
They have no authenticity. You think that's garbage?
No. Absolutely. And I say that for one reason. The Eisenhower briefing document, which was one of the first ones released, has a paragraph in there. It talks about another crash that took place near Del Rio, Texas. I think it's the El Indio Guerrero area of Mexico. And that information came from a guy named Robert Willingham, who said that he had been a colonel in the Air Force and that he was a fighter pilot. And while on a mission, he was alerted to this UFO, and he gave kind of chase, and it crashed in Mexico. And he flew back to his base at Dyess Air Force Base in Texas. I think it's in Abilene, Texas. Got into a propeller-driven aircraft and flew down there and was able to see the craft and the body. Happened in December of 1950. The story came about first. I think it was first published in Skylook magazine, which is MUFON's original publication. It's the March 1968 issue, and I think it's on page 3. And there's a paragraph in there by a Colonel Robert Willingham, but he's not an Air Force colonel. He's a Civil Air Patrol colonel. And Civil Air Patrol, for those of you who don't know, and there's probably many who do not, it's an auxiliary of the Air Force, but it's a civilian auxiliary of the Air Force. And they perform a very vital function. They take care of search and rescue inside the United States. So if an airplane goes down, whether it's civilian or whatever, the Civil Air Patrol is involved in the search and rescue, or the search for the wreckage or of the aircraft. And they wear Air Force uniforms with slight modifications. And people were submitting pictures. Well, here is Willingham in his Air Force uniform from the 1960s. How do you explain that? And I said, well, if you blow up the picture, you can see he's wearing A, the CAP insignia on the collar of his uniform, and B, he's got the metal plate that says Civil Air Patrol, official auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. So it's Civil Air Patrol. The story he tells in 1968 is different than the story that he told in the affidavit that I think we circulated. And I fell for the story again as well. I published it in a book called History of UFO Crashes. I mean, the whole affidavit is in there talking about what he had seen. It's different from what he said in 1968. It's different from what he said to Noah Torres and Ruben Uriarte in their book about the other Roswell, I think is the name of their book. I eventually got documentation about Willingham, and it turned out that he'd served in the Army from December of 1945 through January of 1947. I think that's right. 13 months. He technically is a veteran of World War II because the war didn't officially end until the summer of 1946. Since he was in the Army in December of 1945, he's technically was a veteran of the Second World War. Never heard a shot fired in anger or anything like that. And I checked other documentation he submitted, and it didn't check out. They said, no, this is not right. This is not the way the document would look. This is bogus. We have no record of this guy. And I'm talking to the people in the Air Reserve Personnel Center in Denver, Colorado, and we're looking at documents that he submitted and comparing them to documents that we have from other places. So Willingham's not telling the story. The importance of Willingham is this whole December of 1950 paragraph that shows up in the MJ-12 documents is bogus. It's not true. It's a fake story. Wow. We can trace the story from Willingham to a guy named Todd Zeckel. Zeckel was working on developing a book about this crash, and he had been talking to Bill Moore about it. And suddenly this thing turns up in the MJ-12 document, but it's not true. If the MJ-12 document was legitimate, the guys preparing it for President Eisenhower would have known that this El Indio Guerrero crash was not true, and it wouldn't have been included in there unless it was like a paragraph said, well, we've heard this story, but it's not true. There's other aspects of it that I think annoy Stan Friedman, because he sent me a letter once and said, prove that there's no crash on the plains of San Augustine. I sent him the Eisenhower briefing document because it doesn't mention it. I thought it was kind of a good joke, but nobody seems to. I mean, how do you prove something didn't happen? I sent him the MJ-12 document because there's no reference to that thing, and if it had happened, there would have been a reference to it in the document. So I thought that was great, but nobody appreciates the humor but me.
Well, let's move on then. Let's talk about the Socorro, New Mexico case, because that's another good one. It's one of the top ones, I'd argue, behind Roswell.
I wouldn't argue with you on that it is a very good case. The Socorro case, I think, is the most interesting case. It was a very, 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 The only problem I had when I went into the investigation of the Socorro case, and this came about, was I was talking to Ben Moss and Tony Angiello about their work in Socorro, and they had said that, well, it's not single witness. There were 3 people who called the police station before Lonnie Zamora called them and said, I've seen the craft on the ground. And I'm thinking, well, did you go to the police files to look that up? Did you get the police blotter? And they hadn't done that. And I'm thinking, well, I don't believe this story. But I was going to look at it myself. And I've got access to the complete Project Blue Book files here on microfilm. So I was looking through that, and I came across a document written by Captain Richard T. Holder. He was the uprange, what they call the uprange commander. He was at the Stallion site on the White Sands Missile Range, and it turns out his duty station was closer to Socorro than it was to Alamogordo or White Sands main base. So he lived in Socorro. He's called out that very night that the object is seen by Lonnie Zamora, the police officer from Socorro. He's there within an hour and 20 minutes of this whole thing taking place, and he's interviewing Zamora. But the point is, he put together a short document that very night. And in it, he says 3 people had called the police station to report the object in the sky. And the calls came in prior to Lonnie Zamora saying that he had seen anything on the ground. And I thought, well, there you go. There's evidence. I cannot believe, and I am just beside myself, that nobody bothered to follow that up after. The police dispatcher, I think it's Nep Lopez, didn't write it down because, lights in the sky, who cares? A roar in the sky, and we see this blue flame, and who cares? After Zamora called in and said he'd seen the thing on the ground, and after Sam Chavez, another police officer, was out there to see it, after everybody was out on the seat and seeing the landing depressions that were left behind, the smoking bush that was left as the thing lifted off in the sky, nobody tried to find who those 3 people were. We know the path the object took to get to the landing site. We know the path it took when it took off because Lonnie Zamora was there and he told us these things. So we know those sorts of things. The people would have been easy to find if anybody had bothered to do it, but nobody did. I asked, what's his face? Ray Stanford, there we go, about that, because he was there within days of the thing and had heard the stories. And I said, did you ever try to find those people? And he said, no, but he talked to some auditory witnesses and 2 women that he'd met in a restaurant in Socorro while he was palling around with a newsman down there. And they said they'd heard the thing. And I said, well, you got the names, but he never bothered to follow up on that. And so I asked him, well, do you have the names now? And he said, well, they'd be dead by now. Because he said they were middle-aged or older at the time. And I'm thinking, sure, but there may be family members. We may be able to find a path to them. But he couldn't give me the names. And here's an opportunity to get names of people who were actually involved and could give us maybe some additional information, and we lost that. But Socorro kind of wins over Roswell on one point. There's physical evidence left behind. There was the landing traces of the object on the ground. There were footprints. And it seemed to be a place where a ladder had touched down behind the craft, and there was the holes in the ground like that. But there seemed to be some kind of bizarre footprints around that as well. The landing traces were photographed. There was samples taken. There was a bush that had been burned, and some of the grass or prairie grass and whatnot around the site had been slightly burned as the thing lifted off. But it didn't seem to leave. It wasn't hot. I know Chavez said that he went down there and he touched the bush, although it was slightly smoking, but he could feel no heat from it. So you've got some really good, you've got physical evidence, you've got a police officer involved in it, you've got people interviewing Zamora within literally an hour and a half of seeing the thing. You've got a case that involves alien creatures. He saw the beings down there, and then controversy gets interjected into the case. But I think we can explain all the controversy.
And he's a police officer. That's very credible, right?
There is nothing to suggest that Lonnie Zamora, and I hate to say it this way, would have been bright enough to create the hoax. There's nothing to suggest that he would be motivated to create the hoax. And, when I say there's controversy around it, within a day and a half, he was talking about, well, I didn't really see any creatures. I just sort of these white coveralls down there. And there was controversy about the symbol he claimed to have seen, but it was all generated by Captain Holder and an FBI guy named Burns. And the FBI, by the way, isn't doing very well today. They suggested to him, don't mention the creatures because the newspapers will have a field day with you. And that sort of happened. But the information was out. I think Carl Lorenzen from APRO talked to him about the creatures and got some information about it. And so you go back to look at some of the original stuff that had been said. You look at the APRO Bulletin for May of 1964, which is their long story, the Cora Lorenzen and her husband Jim's Lorenzen stories in there about what they had seen and what they had done when they talked to Zamora and that sort of thing. So you can get all of that. You can get sort of the original information out of the Blue Book files and some of the stuff that was done that very night. The Lorenzens were there within 48 hours, I think it was. Hynek was there within, I think, 96 hours. There was guys coming down from Kirtland Air Force Base that were involved in this thing. There was Holder and the FBI guy, Burns, involved in it. There were other police officers involved. So there's a lot of people involved in this before the case kind of got screwed up by all the theories and stories that circulated around it. But we have enough information from the primary sources that we can get back to the original case. And it's a very good case because there is suggestion of other witnesses. There was another, and I just thought of this, there was a station in Albuquerque. Somebody called about this thing, called the TV station in Albuquerque. And of course, the reporters there, being really efficient reporters, didn't bother to write down the name either because they weren't believing the story. So we had an opportunity of all these people that could have provided us with information, and all of that has been lost to antiquity, I guess.
That's a shame.
Yeah. Now, what's funny is I was telling Captain Ron that this particular case is really, everybody's focused on Roswell, and why do we think this one is getting lost? I mean, your book is, thank God, is putting it out there into the public, but why is this case getting lost over Roswell?
And everybody should be out buying the book and writing reviews on Amazon so I could make a ton of money and retire.
Right. There we go.
The book, by the way, since nobody's bothered to mention the name, is called Encounter in the Desert.
Tony,
and if you're
sweet.
inclined, you can just click on Amazon and buy the book like in 30 seconds and be reading it. I think the problem is Roswell. There's a lot of witnesses of Roswell, people who are involved in it that we can actually point to and says, yes, this guy really did some of this stuff that he says. But there were a lot of witnesses, but it involved everything that we could possibly want in a UFO incident. You had the alien bodies. You had the recovery of the craft. You had the debris. You had the military basically engaging in a cover-up. And it doesn't matter whether you believe it's a Mogul balloon or something else. There was a cover-up put in place to hide some of this evidence. So you've got all of those things, but there's multiple witnesses and multiple newspaper stories. And when you get to Socorro, you've got landing traces and you have the sighting of the creatures, but all you've got are the traces left behind, sort of the footprints left behind. You don't have a possibility of getting the craft. You don't have a possibility of getting the body. So it kind of goes off. And then you get into the part where it's single witnesses, Lonnie Zamora. And he was very reticent to talk about this after the event took place. I have a friend, Bob Cornett, and we used to do a lot of UFO investigations together. In fact, we were probably the first civilians to see the Project Blue Book files when they were declassified back in the mid-1970s.
Oh, wow. That would have been awesome.
When they were still at Maxwell Air Force Base and they hadn't been microfilmed. So we were going through the case files back then. But it's kind of a funny story. I was writing stories for Saga's UFO Report, if you all remember that magazine or can look back at that. And I would call the editor and he'd put me off and wouldn't talk to me. And it'd be like days and days trying to get a hold of this guy to ask a question. And I learned that the Project Blue Book files were now declassified and they were at Maxwell Air Force Base. And anybody Maxwell could see him, but I didn't tell him that part. I called the editor and I said, can I talk to this guy? And he said, well, he's busy right now. Do you want to leave a message? I said, yeah, I'll tell him I can get the Project Blue Book files. And within, like 10 minutes, the phone rings and it's his boss calling me back. And he's suddenly telling me what to look for and what to do. And I said, well, I assume I've got the assignment now. So Bob and I went down there and we looked at the Project Blue Book files. But Bob was in Socorro and he was going to go to the Very Large Array, which is the radio telescope, which I've always called the Whopping Huge Array. And on a lark, he looked Zamora's name up in the phone book and called him. And Zamora, very friendly, said, yeah, we're having a barbecue. Come on down, but we're not going to talk about the UFO.
Really?
So he went down and had a barbecue with Lonnie Zamora, and they didn't talk about the UFO.
How do you not talk about the UFO?
I know, that's like the elephant in the room.
But pardon me?
How do you not talk about the UFO, you know, if you saw Lonnie
Because
Zamora?
you're invited to the guy's house
Yeah,
and you're having barbecue, and he said, we're not going to talk about the UFO.
That's tough.
And that's, that's why you don't. I mean, if I'd been there, I would have tried to gently move the conversation in that direction.
Sure.
And I'm sure Bob did too, but he had no luck. I do know that there are a couple people in Socorro alive today, and I've talked to a couple of them, who gained the trust of Lonnie Zamora, and he told them some things about what had gone on. So, I mean, and the family's still there. His widow lives there, and his daughter lives there. And I think James Fox was there last summer talking to them and got to see some of the information, all the letters that Lonnie Zamora got from people around the world about the sighting. But Zamora was reluctant to talk, and I think part of it was the way he was treated by the news media and the way he was treated by some other people. I mean, Bill Brazel, the son of the man that found the thing in Roswell and found some debris himself, Bill Brazel found some debris, told me that he would get calls from drunks at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning to find out if the story was true. And he would tell them, read the book. And at that point, that was the Roswell incident by Berlitz and Moore. He said, just tell them to read a book, because his testimony in the book was pretty straightforward. I managed to convince Bill Brazel to talk to Don and me. And what I'd done was I'd sent him a letter, and I said, I'd really like to talk to you. And if you'd like to talk to me, call me collect at give him my phone number. And about a week later, I got a phone call and a collect from Bill Brazel. And the one thing he said, I really appreciated the way you approached me, which was sending him a letter rather than calling him on the phone. I didn't tell him that I'd actually talked to him a few months earlier. I just sent him a letter, and if you want to talk to me, and so he did, and he told us. I told him we'd be down in New Mexico, and he agreed to meet us. And he told us later that he told his wife Shirley that if he liked us, he'd help us out, and if he didn't, he wouldn't bother. And so we met him in Carrizozo, New Mexico, at a place called the Outpost Bar, or Outpost Cafe, Bar and Grill, something like that. We sat there and we chatted with him for an hour, couple of hours, and he took us out to. He decided he liked us and was helping us out. And the next time we were there, we were going to go out to the where he'd found the debris, so we'd know exactly where it was. And then Tom Carey, of course, blabbed the coordinates to somebody. Now they're all over the place. But he took us out there, and we're driving out to the crash site, the debris field. And it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and he says, "You fellas want a beer?" And Don, of course, wouldn't touch alcohol if his life depended on it. And I'm thinking, he's helping us out. Somebody ought to have a drink with him. I said, yeah, I'll take a beer. That's one thing that I really like at 8 o'clock in the morning is a warm beer. Right. And I don't think I finished it, but I had some of the beer. And he took us out there and he showed us the site and that sort of thing. So, but I digress from the real point here, which was, Lonnie Zamora would reticent to talk. Bill Brazel reticent to talk. And I don't know how many TV interviews he turned down. And I told a couple of people, send him a letter, see if that'll work. But he just wouldn't. He wouldn't open up to anybody else. I don't know what the deal was there. Told us marvelous stories. One of the things that if you get deep into the Roswell case, and I know I digress again, and I shouldn't do that.
No, it's fine.
But his family had been in New Mexico for like ever. And he told us that at one point his grandmother had run off Pat Garrett. Pat Garrett and a posse showed up at the ranch one time and informed her that they were going to stay the night and be fed. And he got her Winchester out and informed them that no, they wouldn't. Pulled them up. But the historians, and I was reading a book about this, and Wayne Brazel killed Pat Garrett in 1908 in Las Cruces, New Mexico, I think it was. Wow. And you read these books and they say, well, we don't know what happened to Wayne Brazel. I'm thinking, I'm talking to the nephew of Wayne Brazel. Wayne Brazel was Mac Brazel's brother. And I said, what happened to Wayne Brazel? Nobody seems to know. I said, well, I know. I saw him over in Arizona. And he said that after the trial, he was tried for killing Garrett and he was acquitted. and he was given the option to get out of New Mexico, so he moved to Arizona. You hear all these wild, all these wild stories about how he went to South America and did
Right.
this, that, and the other thing. But the truth of the matter is, the family told me what happened to him. I don't know why. The historians couldn't find the Brazel family, because I found them very easily. You just call New Mexico Director of Census Bill Brazel, and they give you a phone number. Well, not anymore. Bill Brazel has passed away, but it was very simple. But I mean, but the real point is, Brazel was for us, was very friendly, and Lonnie Zamora was very reticent to talk to people about what he had seen and what he had done. And the record is very clear on that. We got transcripts of the interviews that were taken that very night of what he said and what he'd seen. We know why he said what he said and why he'd dodged the questions that he dodged. And we have that from Holder. We have that from William Connor, who was the officer that came down from Kirtland. We have Hynek's records of what he said. We've got Ray Stanford's record of what he said. So we've got all of that information taken within hours or a couple of days of the sighting. So we've got a very good, solid case of information, unlike Roswell, where we're going back and having to talk to people 30, 35, 36,
Right,
38
right.
years later about what they saw. Now, a lot of those people have since passed away.
Well, before we have about 5 minutes left, but I also want to talk about other reports around the country at the same time of spacecraft, alien creatures. What do you think was going on at that time that so much sightings were happening at around that year?
Which year?
You're talking about 64?
64, yeah.
64. Well, it turns out, if you look at the history of UFOs, it seemed to have been kind of cyclic. You had the big wave in 1947. Then
Right.
you had a big wave in 1952. Then you had a big wave in 1957. So it seemed like it was going on about every 5 years. And we hit a point where there wasn't a lot of stuff going on, and suddenly it began building into 1964. I don't think that Zamora caused the wave, but it was the beginning of a real uptick that ran for literally years after Zamora's sighting. And I remember seeing, and I shouldn't say this because it dates me, but I guess my white hair kind of gives it away too. I remember watching Walter Cronkite report on the Socorro sighting, and my neighbor saying, "Hey, well, you see this UFO sighting on the news tonight?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that." But I think it was just an uptick in it. There was an interest growing in that sort of thing. It might be that our space program had people looking up into the sky more than they normally did. But we saw this wave sort of build through from 64 to 66 to 67, then kind of taper off. And we didn't get another big blast of the stuff. We had about 6 weeks in 1973 where there was a lot of stuff going on, and then it tapered off until about the mid 1990s. And so the 5-year cycle, of course, kind of disappeared. But I think just a sort of a cyclic thing in the history of the world. And I don't know what sparks it. The skeptics will tell you that, one big report will spark a wave of sightings. And I always thought, no, you go back and you look at it and you see that the one sighting that kind of gets a lot of publicity is buried in among a bunch of others. And you don't know why that particular report got a bunch of publicity. But I think what happens is people realize other people are seeing these things, so they're not as reluctant to talk about what they'd seen. And in almost all the newspaper stories, they will tell you something about who is investigating, whether it's APRO in 64, APRO or NICAP, which was the group in Washington, D.C., or the Air Force, and people have a place to report their sightings. And I think that's why Zamora, reported getting all these letters. There's a place to report a sighting. Well, I saw something too. And I think that you get the spike in it based on a lot of things. And part of it is people are now they're in a group of people who have seen similar things, so they're not out there by themselves, and they have a reporting point, and the news media is interested, so it gets publicity. The wave in 1947 was killed by the news media, actually by the military, because after the Roswell case breaks in the newspaper on July 8th, 1947, the next day, July 9th, you have stories throughout the country, and it's the same story. And I think it's an AP story. Says the Army and Navy moved today to suppress stories of flying saucers whizzing through our atmosphere, and the story and the number of sighting reports drop off precipitously at that point because the newspapers are no longer reporting them. They've been asked not to report it, and they don't. Stop doing it. It also killed part of the ghost rockets. The year earlier, in 1946, there was a lot of ghost rocket sightings, and then the Swedish military decided we don't want those reported anymore, and they weren't reported in the newspaper, and the number of sightings dropped off. And I don't guess people weren't seeing it anymore; it just wasn't being reported and wasn't being recorded. And I think that's part of the problem we face as well today, with people reticent to talk about it, and there's so much crap on the internet. Can I say crap?
Yeah,
Go right ahead.
You can say that.
There's so much crap on the internet that you just don't know what to believe. You've got to filter through all of that. It doesn't matter where you come down politically or anything else. You can find all these sites that will sort of underscore and support your point of view, but they may not be publishing accurate information. And you look at the UFO sites, and I am appalled at the stuff that we know, and I say we as the researchers who have been around forever and a week in this thing, are known hoaxes, but they keep coming up again and again and again. And you debunk the whole darn thing, and you say, this is why we don't believe it, and here's the evidence. And 5 years later, somebody else has published a big story about it on the internet, like they've just discovered it, and the rest of us are unaware of it. So I guess that's a rather cumbersome answer to your fairly simple
No, it was
question.
great. It was great.
I wonder who has Lonnie Zamora's letters now. Can you imagine having
His wife.
that? She does? She still has them?
Yes. And last summer she was showing that material to James Fox.
Oh, wow.
Those would be great to delve into.
And there's some people in Roswell, some people in Socorro who were friends of Lonnie Zamora. And one of them told me that within just months before he died, they had gone out and retraced his route through the city and down to the place where the thing had landed and discussed the whole thing. The guy wouldn't tell me what Lonnie Zamora said, but they discussed it, and it was just a few months before Lonnie Zamora died. But his wife has those letters and that information, and she's kept it all these years, of course. And she showed it to James Fox, and he was producing some kind of a documentary where that stuff might show up.
Well, fascinating, and we really thank you for joining us today on Truth Be Told. So amazing, and I want everybody to go to Amazon or wherever you can pick up the book. It's called Encounter in the Desert, and it's called The Case for Alien Contact in Socorro. So we want you to go and look up Kevin Randle. What's your website again? One more time.
www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And it's free. You just show up and read whatever you want. I do moderate the comments now because there were some people who just couldn't be civil. And then you get all the spam they send it through. So I can delete all that before it shows up on the in the comments and that sort of thing. But it's www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. If you enjoyed the book, put a review up on Amazon, because that actually helps the writers. If you've liked the book, do a review of it, and that helps the writers of the books.
Perfect.
Awesome.
And please, all truth be told, people out there listening to us today and in the future, go and make a comment and read the book. I mean, it's a great story. It's just as relevant as Roswell.
It's a huge case.
A huge case. So, but we want to thank you so much, Kevin. We really appreciate you joining us.
I've had a ball.
Awesome. Well, come back and see us soon. Okay.
I'll be glad to. Let me know.
All right.
Thanks, Kevin.
Take care, sir.
Thank you.
All right, guys, we are out. This is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet.
Captain Ron.
And please join us on our social medias, just Truth Be Told. Go to our YouTube channel, Truth Be Told. Subscribe, share it with a friend, leave a comment, and go to our website, truthbetoldwebtv.com. Subscribe to our newsletter. Check us out on iHeart and on iTunes. Until next time, we see you right here on Truth Be Told.